99% of the pilots I've ever talked to, when I ask the question, have you ever had any specific leadership training? The answer is no, not specific, right?
Yeah.
Well, we've had CRM training. We've had this kind of, I'm like, totally get it, but there's no specific leadership training. So I founded First Class Leaders, and that's what we do.
Welcome to a Wiser Retirement Podcast. Pilots, are you curious about what it takes to be a better leader? I'm Casey Smith, and I'm joined today by Kyle Freiburger from First Class Leaders. Each week, we try to bring you a practical advice on retirement investing and planning for your financial future. Today's a little bit different. We're talking about leadership, which I think can relate to financial success, hopefully, right? So let's get started. Kyle, thanks for doing this with me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, Casey.
So let's talk a little bit about your journey through aviation and how you came to start this organization focused on leadership in the cockpit.
I mean, absolutely. I think it's worth kind of going back to the foundation of where it really kind of all came from, and that kind of goes back to my childhood. I started in aviation when I was quite young. I took my first dual flight lesson when I was 11 years old. I was flying by myself when I was 14. I got my first license at 16. I did everything as soon as possible, and I'm not saying that to gloat. I'm saying that because I went right through the college level, accelerated my training, graduated top of my class, all of these great accolades on my resume. And when I went to apply for one of my first airline interviews, I ended up getting shut down. And I was dumbfounded, to be honest. I was like, what? And so luckily, at least I had the emotion or the acuity to say to myself, well, what do I need to do to interview better, right? Or I must just suck at interviews. That's literally was what went through my head. Not, oh, I must be a bad pilot, which I mean, almost could have. And that's something that we help people with now, because I had other setbacks as well. I'd failed some flight tests, but I mean, I always went on to excel and learn from it. So this interview happens. I don't get the job. And I said to myself, okay, well, what do I need to do? And I went out and spent $1,000 and hired a company to teach me how to interview. And I said, that seemed like the logical thing to do, right?
A lot of us did that.
So, I mean, they give me all these questions, they teach me how to answer them. And I go to Air Canada, which ended up going there and getting a job, getting hired. And so I'm young, I'm 24 years old, and I'm on the airlines, and I navigate my way through the ranks. And I got to about 28 or 29 years old, and I started to have the captaincy in my future. And during that time, I was in a relationship with this person, this female who, I mean, and this all has a point, I promise. I was in this relationship with this female who was a doctor, and I tell this story because I was on paper, should have been a great relationship, right? On paper, I should have been very happy. On paper, everything in my life was quite good. I was making great money. I was a first officer. I was flying overseas. I was going to be a captain. I was dating this doctor. I wasn't that happy. And I was like, what is going on? And I finally asked myself a question. There's got to be something I'm missing. And I ended up ending that relationship and getting into personal development. And one of the main things I got into was learning about my ego, and then learning about leadership, and learning about communication, and learning about all these CRM competency skills that we were taught or told about, at least, throughout my entire career. And the reason that's so impactful is because after a few years, I ended up going captain. I was there for 4 years. I ended up stepping away from the airlines and pursuing First Class Leaders, and I fly a private jet now. But I look back and I say to myself, like, if I didn't ask myself that question, or if I didn't have the right people in my life at the right time, or if I didn't have the right attitude, or all these factors, or these ingredients in a recipe, if I didn't have those things properly, I wouldn't have realized that there's a whole different side of life. And that side of life is leadership and soft skills development, emotional intelligence, words that most people probably don't even know. And I mean, I didn't know, and I always raised my hand to be the first one. I had no idea what emotional intelligence was, or that it was important, or why it was important. And so the reason I share everything, going back to that interview that I had not got the job, is because it actually explains everything now. I had no training from my family, my father, my friends, my schooling, and even in the airline, zero training on how to develop my emotional intelligence and how to develop my leadership skills. And those were the skills that they were looking for in that interview. And
Mm.
so the reason I, luckily passed the airline interview is because somebody taught me how to, BS my way through. And I'll admit it. I had no idea. I was just, okay, sure, I'll say those answers, right? But I had no idea. Versus now, it all makes sense, right? I've deepened my understanding of what it really means to be a leader and what does that really mean? And I've had all the conversations. Looking forward to having this conversation with you. But that really was okay. Well, there's a gaping hole in aviation, in the training in aviation. I've talked to people around the world, companies around the world now. I mean, there's some training, but 99% of the pilots I've ever talked to, when I ask the question, have you ever had any specific leadership training? The answer is no, not specific, right?
Yeah.
Well, we've had CRM training. We've had this kind of, I'm like, totally get it, but there's no specific leadership training. So I founded First Class Leaders, and that's what we do.
That's awesome. I love that story, and you are correct. We all got coached through those first few interviews. I failed. I'm very grateful. I lost my first big one. Was that company's no longer in business,
Mm-hmm.
but the second one I got it right, and it found my home for 10 years before I transitioned out. But yes, you're correct. We all went. We got told, this is how you interview. This is what you do. This is what you wear. And
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it was like going through the motions, right? Who went through it the
Mm.
best? So when you think about aviation, you know, for us as insiders, a lot of it's like watching paint dry. I mean, you just sit there, you're just kind of moving, driving the bus around, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also those moments of leadership's very important. I guess in the news recently, his name just escaped me. The gentleman, the DC-3, we all are. Was it a DC-10 in is it Idaho?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, right? Everyone
Yeah.
listening right now is shouting out the name and all that, but leadership, right? I mean, obviously Sully and the Hudson and all that. That was leadership, but I think this other guy, I'm botching his name, but to be able to asymmetrical control of a DC-10 and getting everyone on board to get that airplane down and saving so many lives. That's probably crazy leadership, especially in the year that happened, right?
Yeah.
So those are like high stakes moments. Thank goodness we don't really experience that on a weekly basis inside commercial aviation. So when just flying day to day, what are some key leadership traits that you think that pilots need to have today? Because I feel like it's changed, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's been upgraded, or it's been evolved. Like what worked 30 years ago doesn't work today. And if you ever have that mentality, that's unfortunately, it's not your fault for. Yeah, it worked this way for 30 years. It's not your fault that it doesn't work. It might not work that way, or that might not be the best way. It's because things evolve. We have different technology, we got 200 reporters in the back of a average size commercial airliner, right? Everybody's got their iPhones they can pull out at any time. So there's just a different way that you have to lead in the modern day. And so we look at it as a very, we look at leadership now as very much more about how we influence and impact the people around us. Conscious leadership, the idea that, how is your tone affecting the people around you? And we're not talking about how do I get everybody to like me. We talk about how do I build trust, right? How do I truly build psychological safety? How do I make you, Casey, you and I are flying together? How do I make you feel super comfortable enough to you can speak up and say absolutely anything because you're my first officer and I'm your captain, and I don't want you to think that you can't say something because you might run the risk of getting embarrassed, or You might get you might get there my phone ringing right in the middle. Yeah. So how do I do these things? And the thing is a lot of people will look externally at the answers versus the internal answers. So we look at soft skills development, so leadership, and one before I talk about the traits, one more thing that you're saying, leadership doesn't start, and you don't want to wait to develop these traits for when those big moments happen, right? Sure, those might be grandiose displays of leadership, but I would argue that
Al
even
Haynes, by the way, Al Haynes.
let's yeah, Al Haynes,
Al Haynes.
but I would
Yes, he just passed away.
right, he was in a crash, right?
No.
Or
He
was that
just
somebody
old age.
else?
Old age. Yeah,
Oh,
he
okay.
passed away in Seattle recently. DC
Okay.
10, 1989.
Yeah. So, I would argue that even in those boring, mundane moments, leadership is very difficult and hard, right? Because you have to learn how to be disciplined. You have to learn how to not be complacent. It's
Mhm.
all those little in between moments that you can practice leadership to become a better leader. So we really push to help people understand leadership doesn't start when you jump in the left seat, when you become a captain, right? Leadership starts way long before that. Like we deal with student pilots right in flight school, and they go through our workshops because developing those soft skills, those leadership skills, they got to start then. You don't want to start developing your leadership skills once you hit the left seat. That makes no sense. So the skills that we teach are things like I alluded to earlier, like emotional intelligence, this idea that managing or understanding our emotions is a critical part. Because if I react, right, if you and I are flying together and you say something that I feel is offensive, or you say something that I already know, right, you give me an answer and I already know it, and I'm like, Casey, yeah, I already know that. If that's my answer to you right away, you're going to be like, maybe I better not speak up anymore, right? Kyle already knows that. Kyle comes off like a know-it-all, but that's not my intention. My intention needs to be, hey, Casey, thank you for sharing that. Those
Yeah.
are very different reactions. But what drives my verbiage, what drives my tone towards you is my emotions. So if you say something to me and I feel like you're trying to tell me what to do, I'm gonna be snippy. I'm gonna say, hey Casey, I already know that, right? But if I am comfortable and I understand where my emotions come from, I'm gonna say, oh, Casey's just trying to help, and I'm gonna thank you, and then that's going to create a very different vibe in the flight deck or among your crew. So emotional intelligence, and then another one that I like to talk about is, sure, we always talk about effective communication. That's an obvious one, but it's not just clear, concise, respectful dialogue. It's psychological safety, understanding that communication isn't about what you say; it's about how it's heard. Right? You can speak all the words, you can rhyme off the SOPs of the procedures, talking a little bit of aviation lingo here, but we can talk about our procedures, right? We could be robots up there, yet we're still crashing airplanes. Like there's still airplane accidents that are caused because of pilot error. Well, why is that? Well, there's a deeper level where pilots don't want to feel like they're going to be shamed or embarrassed. You want to speak up. We want to be
Yeah.
able to say anything, but I'm sorry to tell you guys that there's still this stuff going on where, based on your tone, your reactions, the things that we say, the things that we do, our first officers, our flight attendants, whoever, they might not feel like they can speak up, and share something because they're gonna run the risk of getting embarrassed. So psychological safety being a huge pillar of communication that we teach. Humility and confidence. Um, we call it the dichotomies of leadership. Everything in leadership is an art. It's a balance. It's never 100% one way or the other. And that's why it's a constant practice of the student mentality. Always stay a student, always be learning. So humility and confidence, situational awareness, we talk about that a lot. But what people don't think about is you have to also have self-awareness to be able to be situationally aware,
Mm.
right? So when you're tunnel visioned, right? You're in the simulator, or in aviation, they teach us about tunnel vision. We can get overloaded, we can get stressed, and all of a sudden we're focused on one thing and we don't see the bigger picture. Well, understanding and having self-awareness that, what is the stress? What are the things that cause you that internal stress? That goes back to emotional intelligence. Well, all of those things are going to tie into situational awareness. And the last one I wrote down here that I mean, there's tons of soft skills here, but decisiveness versus collaboration. Right? You're the captain, you make the decisions. Well, yes, but you want to always spark collaboration, and you always want to spark ideas and gain information. And the way that I always like to teach this is if you have 20 different perspectives, you're going to be able to make a better decision than if you just have one, which is your perspective, where you'll always
Sure.
make a better decision the more you collaborate. But then that just comes down to a time thing. If you don't have time, you got to be decisive. So those are just some
We built
to name a few.
we built a whole financial planning firm just off of that last point there. We do
Yeah.
financial planning as a team versus working with just one advisor who's your point person. There's 3 or 4 people that are a part of that process. So that has translated even into business, and business owners can take from that as well. So, I mean, I think I have the answer to this, but I'm interested to see your take on it. How do you think effective leadership impacts overall safety and efficiency of operations? Maybe you have some examples you could share.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I like to explain. I always like to talk about safety with companies. I mean, pilots as well. Um, Most of the time, when we're talking about safety, what people are focused on is their physical safety, right? This idea that I don't want to die in a plane crash. So a lot of our motivation in aviation is to not die in a plane crash, which I mean, it's a good motivation to have, right? The thing is, is that that's out also there's also the psychological safety that we alluded to early that we need to talk about more, right? Because psychologically, I want to feel safe as well. I don't want to go to work and feel shame or embarrassed. Those are like I think they are the worst human emotions, if I read that correctly. They're the human emotions that everybody wants to avoid. You will actually cause your own death before you want to feel shame. There's like studies on it. I won't go into that. And but I can't remember the book off the top of my head that talks about, I think it was a corrupt police system in New York, and people wouldn't come forward even though they knew what was going on because they
Oh,
didn't want to, right, get embarrassed. They don't want to be the rat. They don't want to be. So that's all psychological safety. Um, so yeah, leadership and understanding how your tone, your words, your everything affects the people around you, for better, for worse. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, and I'm not saying it's easy to be perfect at it. And it's not about everybody liking you again. It's about inspiring the trust in people to follow you, even when time is hard, right? Even when you got to be the mean person, let's call it, or the stern person or the authoritative person. So building that trust so that people know that when you are being stern and when you are being authoritative, people trust that you're doing that for their own safety. So that's a big thing. And then efficiency wise, I mean, again, if you think about making decisions and you think about, um, increase in collaboration, increase in communication, we all know that those things are all going to increase safety. Well, again, if you look at the fundamental principles of each one of those, it's going to be some sort of soft skill that needs to be developed. And again, that's where leadership comes in. I'll give you a very clear example. We had a crew. So we had a company that sent us a crew. It was an older captain, late 50s, and a younger first officer, probably mid to late 20s. And we always hear this generational gap thing, a lot of difficulties. What it really is, and it seems like there's lots of cultural differences now, but what it really is just a lack of understanding each other, right? It's just a lot of wrongful assumptions, a lot of just the inability to really take the time to understand how to communicate with that person. So we taught those people over the course of one day. We use a behavioral assessment tool. We use leadership concepts. We go through practical exercises. It's very, very interactive. And after one day of, I would say, if I summarized it, deepening self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and understanding of different behavioral tendencies in people, the number one thing that came out of it is, oh my God, I didn't realize that that person thought that way. I didn't realize that other people think differently than me. And it sounds silly, but it's very true. We all walk this earth on a different path. And so coming out of that crew went from literally they were going to resign, and the company said, okay, let's just, they couldn't work, they didn't hate each other, that they weren't mad at each other, they just couldn't get along,
Hmm.
and they were going to have to quit their jobs and go get new jobs. That's how bad it was. And the company
Wow.
said, okay, let's try one more thing. And they sent them to me. And it's been well over a year now. And I keep following up because they're one of my best examples. And they're like, my life's changed. Not just between the two of them, between them and their wives, between them and their kids, the older guy and his kids.
Yeah,
Their life completely changed. So,
that's awesome. So there's a lot of changing dynamics in the aviation history, or industry, I should say. Um, Technology wise, I mean, heck, they're even talking about Alpa has got a whole campaign now about no one pilot cockpits. I mean, we have the whole rift between, is jokingly, but Boeing pilots versus Airbus pilots, right?
mhm.
Where Airbus is so easy to fly and Boeing just has so many of those buttons. So it's
I can attest to that. I flew both.
um, so how do you think that how should pilots be adapting their leadership style to stay effective as we move forward into this new environment? Because I mean, part of it too is I think there's more people in the cockpit than before. Before, when I'm 47, when I started my aviation career in my 20s, um, we wrote the departure time and arrival time on a little book.
Yeah.
And when I left, the airplane did all that, and you couldn't add 10 minutes to your flight every day to get a little extra money.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Now it's
you know,
all,
I think about FMS and its advancements. My first plane had no FMS. The next plane, you can put all the data into the airplane, and it kind of did its thing. That was just a CRJ, but nearly as advanced as some of the more modern airplanes.
Hey, fellow aviators! Before we dive back into this episode, I've got some awesome news to share. On our website, we've got a freebie just for you. Our team of financial advisors has done the legwork to provide you with free 401k allocations for all the major airlines. Getting your hands on your airline's specific allocation is a breeze. Just click the link in the episode notes or head over to pilotretirement.com. Now let's get back to the good stuff in this episode.
As you said earlier, you said it before we started the podcast, but everyone's a reporter behind you now. Everyone's carrying cell phones to video the crazy lady that won't get out of her seat or is offended by the Trump hat on the other side of the aisle. Just crazy stuff, right? So
yeah.
how do we adapt to all this as leaders?
I mean, there's a few things that come to mind without getting into the actual ins and outs, because it's not something that you can teach obviously over a 30-minute podcast. But there's things to look out for. So number one, as I would say, is embrace the student mentality. My idea is always stay a student, right? Like you just never think that you know something 100%. And the moment you think you know something 100%, it shuts off the door of possibly discovering a better, easier, more efficient or effective way, right? It's okay to think 99%. You can be very confident in your 99%, but just keep that 1% open. So that's number one. Number two is leverage, so I show a graph in our workshop, and it's a graph of like technology versus our ability to adapt. And we can't keep up. Technology has well surpassed our ability to adapt to that technology, right? We have ChatGPT, we have airplanes that I couldn't possibly know every button or I know, we know every button, but let's say we don't, like inside the computers and stuff. I mean, it can go
Right,
deep. Like we don't know
right,
everything. So it's more
or not
important
or not told everything.
so yeah, 100%. And this is why maybe 30 years ago it worked to have that old, leadership mentality where I'm the captain, I'm the leader, versus now it's really important to understand leadership is a way of being. It's not a title. It's not the captain's not the leader. Leadership is a way of being. It's an art. And the reason I say that is because it's more important than ever to be able to collaborate, right? Because if we don't know everything and we can't possibly know everything, then it's more important the most important thing would be for if you and I are flying together, Casey, the most important thing is that we're getting the most out of each other together. And the only way to do that is to develop your leadership and soft skills. Only way, right? The moment you feel like I'm being, arrogant or micromanaging, you're going to shut down. And if I'm not aware of that and we can't talk about it, then we're done. And then now your brain and my brain aren't computing together. They're separate entities. And we just don't have the power together or that we would together. And the reason I say that is because if we focus on soft skills more, and we start to promote these healthier, psychologically safe spaces, we're going to obviously increase everything that we talked about before, efficiency, and it's not just in aviation; it's in our personal lives too, right? Learning how to build a relationship really to the point where we trust each other with our lives, and we can say anything we want because we know that we're safe, and that's what we want in our lives, in our personal lives. But it's incredibly hard, and it's not a perfect science. So then the other thing I would say is to adapt is leverage technology. So we use a specific behavioral assessment tool called DISC, and it's an online portal. I mean, there's several versions of it. You've already heard about it by your reaction. Mm-hmm. So we use DISC Catalyst, which is a portal. You log into it, you do a 30-minute assessment, gives you your personality or your behavioral tendencies. It's different than a personality test. It's a behavioral tendency test. And the way I like to explain it, if I simplified it, is most people think that we have strengths and weaknesses, but we don't. Strengths and weaknesses are your perception of somebody's attribute. So I, for an example, have an attribute of, let's say, passion, and like I'm very outspoken, I'm very passionate, I'm very determined. That's an attribute. Well, right away, if you look at the attribute, you can see how that attribute could be seen as a strength or a weakness depending on the scenario, mm-hmm. right? So you're asking me questions. I'm doing most of the talking right now. But if this was in like a general conversation, we're trying to build a relationship, you're probably like, wow, this guy talks a lot, right? But that's just my passion and my determination. But if I'm not aware of that, right, I could do nothing wrong, yet you could not like me. So It's understanding attributes instead of strengths and weaknesses. Because if I looked at you and like, oh, your weakness is X, Y, Z, I'm not looking at where your strength is in that equation. And so as a leader, if I understand your attributes, then I can say, hey, here's the situation, right? How do we get the best out of each other? Right. And now we can bring our attributes to the table. We can see which attributes do we need to each pull on in this scenario to move forward the best that we can. So I would say those, and then just reiterating the psychological safety that I was talking about before. I think that's something we need to talk about more and more and more. We need to feel safe enough to speak up without feeling shame, embarrassment, without feeling like we're going to get ridiculed. And the problem is we are going to get ridiculed. we are going to feel shame and embarrassment sometimes. But it's learning about psychological safety, and it's learning that even though we feel that shame and embarrassment sometimes, we have to keep striving towards creating that safer space for ourselves and for each other.
We use that DISC program for all the new hires when they're interviewing. And I kind of wish we kept it and we put it on everyone's office door. And before I walked in, it would remind me how to communicate to that person, because it's very powerful. And you can say certain things that can trigger a person, right? Even if you don't know it, just internally, they're dying on the inside, right? But that's a very powerful tool. So let's shift gears just for a second. There's so many young people now aspiring to be airline pilots, and overall, I mean, what a great time. I mean, it'd been awesome to get hired a major in the hot market of a year ago. It's slowed down a little bit, but it'll pick back up with all the older guys that are gals that are going to be retiring over the next few years. But so if you're talking to someone who's, maybe they've in the process of their undergrad, or they're about to exit school, they're starting the 1,500-hour journey or 1,000-hour journey to get qualified to fly, what would you say to them right now? What advice would you give them as far as honing in on leadership skills and preparing for that interview, maybe a little differently than you and I had to do it?
Yeah, I mean, invest in your own self development, right? And specifically into all the soft skills that we mentioned throughout this episode. Um, it's just nobody's gonna like really. I know this is I think it's really relative. I had a bad relationship with my father most of my life, and he was a very strict person. Was abusive to a degree, like more not abusive, but let's call it the disciplinary, verbally and mentally, or verbally and physically. But the only reason I'm saying all of this is because I used to be the victim, right, of my dad. I used to be like,
Mhm.
well, my dad, I'm this way because of my dad. I'm this way because of my upbringing. I'm this way because of this. That used to be my excuse, right? When people called me arrogant or people call me these negative things, I would just come up with an excuse because I'm like, well, I'm just this way because of these people. Leadership is about understanding that you can take the lead. So I can take the
Yeah.
lead for my father. I can take so for my father, for an example, is I finally said this to myself. I said, what if my dad just didn't have a good leader in his life? And maybe he just thinks that this is the best way of doing it. And that was actually the most logical thing I ever thought. And so now my dad and I have these conversations about how his dad, he thought that his dad was doing things the wrong way and he just tried to do things better. And then he realizes now that some things he didn't do, he could have done differently.
Mhm.
But it allows us to now deepen our relationship, and he's open to letting me help him challenge what he thinks he knows. And so I stopped becoming the victim. I
Mhm.
stopped becoming the victim of everybody and everything around me. So leadership is about understanding that you can take the lead on anything. Nothing is everybody else's fault. Everything is your fault. You get to decide how you perceive everything.
Yep.
I mean, there's true victims out there, but even those victims, those are physical victims. Even those victims need to learn how to stop being the victim mentally. And
Right.
Viktor Frankl wrote it the best in Man's Search for Meaning, a great book. He was a psychologist that came out of Auschwitz, the concentration camps, and he says a man can be robbed of everything but one thing: his ability to choose how he perceives any given situation. He says that's the only way anybody survived Auschwitz. They had nothing, the absolute rot, nothing, 4 years. And he survived because he chose to believe that everything that he was going through was an opportunity for him to learn a lesson, to share with the world. And that really resonates with me. So anybody listening, it's invest into your personal development, your soft skills development. The technical stuff, the flight schools, the airlines, they got you covered. You don't need to worry about figuring out what technical skills to go and invest in. But unfortunately, most companies will not be investing in your soft skills. It's a very difficult thing for a company to invest in. It doesn't have very tangible ROIs. It does if you measure over the course of a long term, but it's very difficult for a business to justify. I mean, we're convincing businesses to do it. It's a very
Yeah.
difficult battle. So again, leadership is not about waiting for a business or a company to invest in your soft skills. It's about you understanding that developing communication skills, emotional intelligence skills, all of those skills are going to better you in every which way, personally and professionally. So the more you do that, the other thing I would say that's very close to that is seek feedback and mentorship. The best thing I ever did. So an autopilot will crash an airplane 10 out of 10 times if doesn't have feedback,
Right.
right? It has to have feedback all the time, literally every second. And because it has so much feedback, it can be very accurate. Well, how are we expected to navigate our lives and become better and navigate our lives accurately if we don't get feedback? And the problem is we don't, or we don't know how to receive it, or we get triggered when we receive it, or we get upset when we receive it, or we're not asking the right people, right? We're not getting the right feedback. So ask for feedback, and the best way to do that a lot of times is through mentorship. Ask for that feedback from somebody who's walked in your shoes, and that would be, those would be. And then, sorry, one more thing. I mean, there's
A
always
bonus.
lots. One more bonus point. Leadership doesn't start when you get in the left seat. It starts absolutely right now. No matter who you are, it starts. It's just the moment you hear this or realize it or whenever that is, there's an old proverb. I think it's a Chinese proverb. It's the best time to plant a tree was today, but the second best time, no, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time to plant that tree was today, right?
Right.
So leadership is a art. It's a way of being. Don't think that you will be a leader once you're a captain. You don't get to choose if you're a leader. It's whether people trust and follow you. That's what dictates whether you're a leader.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I love your statement on not being the victim. I think so many people, and this is not aviation centered at all, but just so many people choose to be the victim, and they live such poorer quality lives than if they had chosen not to be the victim. I think Donald Miller has several books that help people be the hero of their own story, which is pretty cool. But sometimes I feel like I'm even with clients. I tell them same thing I tell my 17-year-old daughter is you're responsible for your own joy. Like no one can take your joy from you. If you lose your joy, it's because you gave your joy away to somebody, right? Now, happiness and joy are two different things, obviously. But if you had a really bad day, but you choose not to be the victim, like you still find the joy in what the journey is and what you're doing, right? And the pilots can be such a negative bunch. I don't know. We didn't really establish your location, but you're in Canada, as we jokingly said before the podcast, the 51st state of the United States. But you're, I don't know about the pilot groups you associate with up there, but down here we have several that can be very negative, just very just all this negative energy. There's one pilot group in particular. I'm not going to call them out on a podcast, but I just remember talking to a guy. He called me up. He said, "Hey, I knew you from your ASA days, and I'm at this airline now, and I'm thinking about starting my own business, and I just want to know what the journey's been like for you, and if I should be doing this." I was like, "Well, what business do you want to start?" And he's like, "I don't know yet." And I'm like, "Oh, this is a poor me. I'm a pilot. Poor me. I'm a pilot conversation." And so I said, "Look, I'm very passionate about what I do, but I work 60 hours a week. I work way more than what you actually work." And I finally said, "Tell me, which airplane are you on?" And he tells me, and then I said, "You move about 6 miles a minute, right?" And he's like, "Yeah, six, 7, somewhere in there." I said, "That's pretty cool." And so you see sunrises, you see sunsets from like 30 plus thousand feet. He's like, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, "You work like 15 days out of the month max, and if you can get your vacation right, you can drop trips, and you could have like a month off if you did it right." Right. So, yeah. And I said, "You're making X amount of dollars, way more than the national average for business owners." It's like, yeah, that's true. That's true. And I said, "So what do you not like about your job?" He's just like, He's like, "I don't know. Everyone just tells me it's so bad." And I'm like, "Yeah, you're a first officer. You're flying with guys who are angry because the contract negotiation didn't go the way you wanted to. But here's the thing. You're about to upgrade. You can set the tone. You can have a 4-day trip that's filled with happiness and joy."
Yeah. I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head, man. And I'll do you one better just to add to what you just said. There is a concept, and it's written in a book. And if you are listening to this podcast and you go buy that book, please reach out to me and let me know if it made a profound change in the way that you perceive things. Let me know, because I have literally bought that book for a lot of people, but given that book out or gotten people to read this book, and it's just constantly or consistently the same message being, wow, I didn't realize how much I was causing my own suffering. And it's called The Gap in the Gain. And I think Dan Sullivan is the author. The Gap in the Gain. And it's literally what you're saying. The idea is, I can give it really quickly because it's very pertinent or relevant. So the idea is, we're always chasing a goal. We're always setting our goals, right? Everybody talks about goal setting. So we're setting our goals and we're chasing those. And the problem is we're measuring ourselves between where we are now and where we want to be, right? So, but it's always moving. It never ends, right? So we're always chasing. So
Right.
it's a dumb way to measure. Like you would never measure anything else that way versus like let's say a tree, right? If a tree is growing, you're not going to measure, well, how far do I want it to grow and how far, like how much has it grown? That's not what you're measuring. You're measuring how high it is. Like where did it start? It started at a seed and it's up to 2 feet now, right?
Yeah.
So the gap and the gain is saying, well, the gap is when we're operating in this, well, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet, right? And it causes us a victim mentality. You're always negative, and nobody wants to be around that person. Yet, I guarantee you, if you pay close attention and you throw your ego out of it, 9 times out of 10, you are in the gap. And then what you realize is it's very easy to do. It's very easy to be in the gap. But you want to shift and you want to be in the gain, which is okay, I started with 0 and here I am. I was not a pilot at one point. Now I am. I would have given anything to be at the airlines at one point, right? And now I'm at the airlines, right? I would have given anything to make $100,000. Now I make on, but we're not thinking that way. And we're scared that if we think that way, we're going to stop, right? Or we're not going to accomplish great things. But think about it. Who's going to be more likely to tackle challenges and accomplish great things? The person who is positive and grateful for what they already have, right? Who's optimistic, who's jumping into that challenge with optimism because they're very grateful, or the person who's like, "Oh my God, another challenge. Oh my God, another," right? So
Right.
it's understanding that it's not about where you are, it's about where you've gotten to already, or it's not about where you're going to be, it's about where you've already accomplished. And that mindset, you take that mindset into the challenge. So that's little nightcap for everybody. If you want to read that book, it's a phenomenal book. It's worth reading several times. It's a simple concept, but it's got profound results.
Kyle, how do people work with you? So any of our listeners wanted to dive into this more. Tell us the options.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got 2 offerings. The first and foremost is our community. We have the Pilot Leadership Network, which our philosophy here is just to build a global network of pilots who are all growth oriented. So you're not going to get anybody in the network who's fixed mindset or doesn't want to learn. Everybody who shows up to the network, they're saying by just being there, I want to learn, I want to grow. And when you put people together like that, especially pilots, it's exclusive to pilots.
What's
Great things
the
can happen.
what's the URL for that?
So that you can find both our offerings at our website, firstclassleaders.com. And so our second offering is a 1-day workshop. It's actually open to anybody. It's not just for pilots. It is a leadership workshop. It's geared towards pilots, but we've had people from lots of different industries in it now. I think everybody loves the pilot lingo that's in there, and it always sparks some good conversation. But it's leadership, it's soft skills, it's it's dealing with
For
people.
a lot of people, it makes it something that seems kind of frou-frou to some people, some generations. It makes it more manly, right?
Yeah,
Just add an airplane
absolutely.
to it.
Absolutely. Hey man, you got to lean in. I mean, it's a cool industry, right?
Absolutely. So tell me more about, like you said, it was earlier, $20 a month. Is that what the pricing you have?
Yeah, so we literally offer a free version of our network, which is come in, check it out. We do live events. We got a mentorship program. We've got training videos. There's some stuff for free, and then we just charge $20 a month if you want to unlock everything. I mean, it's a Netflix subscription, except instead of learning nothing through Netflix. I mean, there's some good documentaries on Netflix. You can watch videos on the stuff that we've talked about today, and specific in aviation, and share. One of my favorite. This is how I describe the network. This is the goal. It is the idea that wisdom and experience are 2 different things. People think I have so much experience. I have 10,000 hours. I have 30,000 hours of flight experience. But experience is useless unless you evaluate it. Once you evaluate experience, it turns into wisdom. So if you put a bunch of pilots together or a bunch of people together, anybody can use this philosophy, and you evaluate your experiences together, your challenges, what you screwed up, your mistakes, think about it, and you evaluate those with everybody else, you are all gaining more wisdom. And that's our philosophy at the Pilot Leadership Network.
That's awesome. Well, Kyle, thank you for your time today. For our listeners, want to follow any other episodes related to airlines. We have episode 173, which is making the most of your airline 401k. Episode 204 is from flight school to financial freedom, building wealth in the aviation industry. We also have a YouTube channel called A Wiser Retirement, which follows the podcast. You can watch this live. We also have on that channel is saving everything into a Roth for your retirement, the best strategy. That one's gotten many views recently. Also, for Delta pilots that are still trying to navigate the market-based cash balance plan, or even if you're at American or United and you're about to get that, we have a video specifically for that. And then tips for airline pilots as they approach retirement. These are all short videos that we add. We've also linked the Pilot Leadership Network, which would be the first class leadership or first class leaders link that Kyle just mentioned here as well. Kyle, again, man, I saw some of your stuff online and I just reached out to you and then, hey, do this podcast. I think our listeners would love this. And this is a big hit. This is awesome, man.
Yeah, I really appreciate Casey. Anytime anybody listening wants to talk about leadership, I mean, I do only have so much capacity, but getting on platforms like this and being able to reach a broader audience. And I'll just reiterate, like, this is stemming from literally me knowing nothing and having a very stressful and difficult life with, empty relationships. Like, this is all stemming from that. So I hope it doesn't sound like I'm on a soapbox. I hope it really sounds like it's coming from a place of general curiosity and understanding of how to just have a more fulfilling, fruitful, connective life.
And we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys next time.